Hi Bookworms, Soren here. Just dropping in since unless you follow us very closely on Twitter, this might not be the episode you were expecting today. We wanted to put this out as sort of a bonus episode to celebrate Disability Pride Month in July, but unfortunately I fell pretty ill recently and I'm still catching up on editing as a result. Our episode on The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley should be with you within the next few days, after which we will, fingers crossed, be back on schedule, but in the meantime we hope you enjoy this episode on writing disability in the fantasy genre, alongside the absolutely delightful Ella T. Holmes. And also, a belated happy Disability Pride to all of our fellow disabled bookworms. Please remember every single one of you is loved and deserving throughout the year.
Welcome to the Hidden Bookcase. Come through and get cozy. Pick a book, your favourite book, that's the one that opens this room. Inside you'll find a warm fire, a loving cat, and a wide skylight to the stars.
And a dangerously high to be read pile.
I'm Morgan, I use they them pronouns, and I am a magical spy with no hands or tongue.
I'm Soren, I use he him pronouns, and I am a cane-wielding, magicless liberal.
My name is Ella, I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Leonid prince whose tattoos are meant to be attractive to my future wife.
Soren and I have been friends for over a decade, and the two of us are always swapping books.
Usually, the two of us take it in turns to recommend one another a favourite read. Today we're talking about writing fantasy with disability in mind.
So let's get into it.
So, we're here today with Ella T. Holmes.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for coming, we're so excited to have you. And we're here for Disability Pride Month. Happy Disability Pride Month to people listening to this, because it will actually be July when you're listening to this.
We're so on time this year.
We're so on time. We were on time last year, what do you mean? And Ella, I found you on Twitter because of your current anthology project, the Disability and Fantasy Anthology. Would you like to tell listeners a little bit about it?
So, I'm actually really surprised that, or I guess maybe not that surprised that you found me on Twitter, because I haven't been super active on there. And actually the anthology is what spurred my reawakening on social media a bit, I think. So the anthology kind of came into being because once upon a time, someone on twitter.com had a really, truly terrible take, which, as I'm learning, is actually quite a recurrent take that pops up every now and again. I just have not been around to see it. And that take was basically that disabled people don't belong in fantasy. And that kind of felt really weird to see in dark blue and white words, and then that sort of take blew up. People were saying, in a fantasy setting, wouldn't you just cure all disability? It doesn't make sense for disabled people to even exist if your world has magic in it. I remember distinctly someone said that, it would be much cooler if wheelchair users didn't exist in fantasy and instead they all just floated like puppets on strings. And I just felt like that was so weirdly dehumanizing in a way, even though, giving benefit of the doubt, I'm sure they didn't actively mean it that way. I also saw a take that I don't think I'll ever be able to forget, which was that I read for escapism, I don't read to see depressing things, as if disability is in any way this inherently sad or tragic thing to include in a story. So that genuinely chafed me quite a bit, especially given the current climate of the ongoing pandemic and this expectation that disabled people should just stay home. So I think I made a tweet in reply because I couldn't help myself, which was basically to the effect of the world already kind of doesn't welcome disabled people in real life public spaces. And now what you're saying is that we're not welcome in fictional spaces as well. So where exactly is there room for us was the sort of central thesis of the anthology. And then I kind of just realized that on top of all of the other emotional and sort of intellectual labor that you already have to do as a marginalized person, we kind of have to make these spaces for ourselves. That's an unfortunate truth that I'm still kind of coming to terms with. So as a somewhat quite cowardly creature of spite, I would say, I decided to kind of pull myself up by my bootstraps while crying and just create the anthology myself and be like, well, this is where at least a dozen of us can sort of have our voices heard. Hopefully that will do something to sort of fight back against the frankly silly take that disabled people don't belong in fantasy spaces. Basically, the goal of the anthology was to use what power and knowledge that I have to platform and uplift disabled authors and all of their wonderful stories with disabled characters in them to try and in some way prove that, yes, we actually do belong here and our stories can be fun and these stories can be wonderful and amazing. And they're not something that you need to go in with fearful eyes, I would say, is the goal.
And honestly, I know you were joking, but I would definitely characterize it more as righteous anger than spite. I feel like it's very common for us to say, especially as a queer person, I feel like I find myself saying it all the time, or then with disability or with being mixed race, I'm doing this out of spite, when I'm running a character. But at the same time, I feel like we do deserve to be here. So maybe it's not spite.
Yeah, I actually I really appreciate the sort of call in to like reframe it as righteous anger, because this is something that like as a heavily conflict avoidant person, I'm always like, oh, tee hee ha ha, this is spite. I'm just doing this because someone told me I can't do it. But no, I think you're entirely right that this is like something that is not, it's not an unreasonable reaction, right? Like it's a much needed sort of pushback.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're doing something brave by opening yourself up to a lot of ableism, because you do automatically, if you put up a platform for disabled people. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be the reality of the situation, but obviously it is. So.
And of course, like when you are active on a platform like Twitter, even when you don't necessarily open yourself up to these kinds of debates, they just kind of fall in your lap anyway. But it's been all right so far. Like I have had to field a few strange people in my inbox, and I've had to sort of have open discussions even with disabled creators who kind of chafe against the use of the word disability even, which has been interesting. But ultimately that also felt kind of relatable to me, because I'm only 3 years into my advocacy journey, and there was a time in my life where I also was laboring under this idea that the very word disabled was bad. Like it was just a negative thing always. I'm just so incredibly like blown away with the support, but I'm also incredibly grateful for all of the conversations that have arisen as a result of me and my righteous anger.
But no, I do relate to that a lot. I think even yesterday I was having lunch in a cafe with my father. We were talking about something we want to write together, actually. We were saying, maybe that's one that we can tackle, because we wrote something about like trans kids and trans families somewhat recently. And then I was talking about my own experiences with disability, and I felt really awkward saying, oh, I'm disabled at like a cafe where there were other people, even though I'm like, well, there's nothing wrong with it. But there was still like a big part of me that was like forcing myself to do that.
Yeah, it is a strange kind of obstacle almost to get past, because I'm the same, even though I think my mother would tell everyone that I'm very loud about the fact that I am disabled or that I have a disability, because I can be. But there are still moments, right, where you're in a public setting and the thought crosses my mind that if I say, well, I'm disabled, blah, 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 in conversation, I just have a weird fear that, someone walking past will look me up and down and be like, you don't look disabled, because that's happened to me in the past. And so I'm constantly sort of fielding these hypothetical antagonists in my life. But it's also, the issue again of like this sort of internalized ableism, or like internalized ideas of how disability makes you or anyone else around you feel. So I think it's very complicated.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So obviously Fourth Wing was released last year, and it opened up a lot of conversation about disability and fantasy, I feel like, and we have discussed it quite a lot on the show. As someone who has read it, I have brought it up a few times. But you wrote an article which gave sort of a perspective I hadn't seen before, which was really interesting, about toxic perseverance, and that was for Just Geeking By. I'd love you to talk about the toxic perseverance in there a little bit. Is that something you've continued to see in fantasy this year?
Firstly, for like anyone who isn't familiar with the term toxic perseverance, this was, if you read the essay, I was quite openly like, this is surely a thing. It's so common, but for my purposes with disability narratives, specifically, I'm going to call it toxic perseverance. And I defined it in my essay as, in disability narratives, the unhealthy persistence of doing something that is detrimental to oneself and one's body. So this does pop up quite often in a lot of disabled stories, wherein a character might either overcome their entire disability, either permanently or momentarily, or they overcome their symptoms and pain in order to succeed at something. The pattern there is that they consistently earn their heroism and success not by working with their disability, but by working against it or working through it. And this is something that pops up a lot, not just in fantasies. I have been reading less fantasy this year because I'm trying to branch out and be more diverse in the genres and the authors that I read. So I can't say that I've seen a lot of toxic perseverance this year specifically in fantasy, but it is like such a common narrative of heroism in general, right? Whether the hero is disabled or non-disabled, to have to like overcome some great limitation or push through limits in order to succeed. Perseverance is like obviously not a disability specific thing. And this fact is used to sort of disagree with my thinking critically about the toxic perseverance that I picked up on in Fourth Wing. However, I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that in the context of disability specifically, the act of persevering or perseverance can take on a different meaning or feeling because there are very real life expectations and social scripts and ableist sort of ideology and consequences tied into it. Often in disabled stories, toxic perseverance will show up throughout the whole story. It's not just one sort of bombastic moment. It's like a constant thought process of I have to shelve my pain, or I ignore my pain and I win the sword fight, or I work through the buckling of my knees. And like realistically, that should have consequences. But often in the toxic perseverance narrative, it's sort of brushed over as, yay, success, they won the sparring match. But then the same acknowledgement and weight isn't given to the raw reality, the consequences of having pushed through their bodily limitations or their disability or their symptoms in the first place. And that personally, like, really grinds my gears because I think disabled people are so often held to the expectation that we do overcome our symptoms or our limitations in order to perform as well as non-disabled people. And in some cases, we even have to perform better than that to earn our place or like prove that we are worth the same or like to get the job and things like that. Like, I don't know how many times I've sort of been to a doctor and they've told me to just try harder. And then I've ended up dislocating a joint or ended up bedridden for a week because I did exactly what they said, right? It can feel like quite a subtle thing because I think naturally you want to root for the character and you want them to succeed. And so in a book where their body is working against them, when they succeed against the very sort of vessel that they go through life with, that can feel triumphant. But personally, it's kind of like a nightmare because when you are someone who lives that life, it's sort of like, why is this the fantasy?
Yeah. I almost feel like we're seeing it more with abled characters in terms of more explorations of like burnout and how that can come back to bite you, essentially. But I feel like when it comes to disabled characters, there is that sort of double standard where it is this expectation, one, that you will push through, and two, that you will not have any consequences later on, and that there won't be a moment where everything actually catches up with you.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like it's just such a common sort of obstacle for people to have to overcome something in some way. Like that is the central sort of conflict of stories, right? Is the overcoming of something. It is kind of normal and to be expected, but it's also like in the context of disability, maybe we need to look at what message that is sending. Also just in terms of like non-disabled characters, for example. So like slightly adjacent. I often see toxic perseverance pop up with non-disabled female characters who are made heroic through the overcoming of their like femininity or their feminine traits, which is interesting to me because like femininity or like being a woman used to be considered an actual disability. So it is sort of like tangentially related.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there has been a shift recently. We've talked about this on the show a couple of times about how female characters in fantasy have been written, and there used to be very much like a not like other girls narrative, and lack of femininity or masculinity, you know, to use those terms loosely, was praised. So it's interesting to see maybe that's coming along a little bit, but this attitude of, oh, this is the thing that needs to be changed has not moved on to, because I guess it was always, fantasy has a very long history of being pretty ableist, but has persisted in certain groups more so than in others. Not to say that it's a resolved problem with female characters, because I definitely don't think that it is.
I think it's also just kind of lazy writing, because you obviously every narrative has something to overcome, and if you go, they have a disability to overcome, that kind of gets the author out of actually having to plot genuine things to overcome, and it's just like, oh, here's a thing, and then they're magically better, have fun.
Yeah.
I feel like in that case, even if they are sort of engaging with disability in a meaningful way, like maybe it's an own voices novel like Fourth Wing is, it's sort of like, cool, we got the rep, like we have the disability, right? And we have this badass female character and that's wonderful. But then it's also like, I guess it raises the question for me of why couldn't she just once be a hero without having to overcome her body or her disability? That's like a big thing for me. And so I think that's the real part that gets forgotten often. The sort of maybe lazy writing of, well, I'll give them a disability. Their whole body can just be the obstacle, but then not thinking ahead and being like, well, what would the consequences of that be? Because that rolls on. We don't have snow here in Australia, but I imagine it kind of like a snowball, right? Like you're sort of going through the motions and things are getting worse and you're constantly pushing through. When are you going to burn out? When is that shoulder dislocation going to be something that you need to go to the hospital for? When is your chronic pain going to get so bad that you actually have to lay for 3 days in bed? That's the core of often what I feel like is missing from some disabled stories. But it is a difficult sort of thing to discuss critically because there is always the argument of disabilities are not all the same. 3 people can have EDS, I have EDS, and experience it completely differently. And so I don't ever want to make it seem like I'm saying, oh, this rep is good, this rep is bad, because I think it's really, really subjective and up to interpretation. In this discussion, I'm very much talking about what I feel like is missing. That's where I'm sort of coming from.
Yeah. It feels like how when queer characters were first becoming a bit more mainstream in novels, and it was kind of like, any book has a queer character, I'll read it, because the bar is so low for getting representation. You're like, oh my God, I'll read it anyway, like even if I have issues with certain things, because you're so unused to getting to see yourself in that, in like books and in narratives. And I feel like that's where we've come to, or we're starting to get over that with disability rep and starting to be like, okay, but we need more nuance now. We need to actually think about what messages we're giving and like what representation is like quote unquote good.
Yeah.
That kind of reminds me of the marketing tactic of like, oh, well, this is gay, or like, oh, well, this has lesbians in it. And it's like, at one point that is like very much a selling point because, you know, you go for so long without seeing that at all. So it is a draw. But at a certain point, you're kind of like, okay, so we have a sapphic couple in this book, but what is the actual story? Like, what is the book actually about?
I've got options now. That's not all I want.
You sort of want to better curate your reading experience. And I think that's in terms of like disability rep for me, I think Fourth Wing was sort of the hump that I got over where I was like, oh my God, this main character has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I have that. That's amazing. I ran to my book club and I was like, what is everyone thinking? Should I read it? You know, how is it? I was very upfront and I was like, I'm sensitive to, you know, books that have ableism in it that isn't sort of condemned or problematized or critiqued or engaged with meaningfully. And a couple of people said, well, it seems okay so far. So I jumped right in. And then I was like, I feel like I just need more. That was sort of the prompt for me to be like, I really want to get better at curating my reading. I want to actually know what's in the story or who the character is, maybe. I don't know, just like treat it like a normal book, right? Because I don't think you see cis heterosexual able-bodied stories, right? They don't have those labels on there. They don't need to be there because I think that's the default assumption. But like my point is kind of to that. It's that they sell the book based on the story, not on the identity.
That would be so funny. Imagine like this book has a straight couple.
It's very interesting to talk about Fourth Wing because as somebody who also has EDS but has done a lot less reading, I think, around that sort of subject, when I did read Fourth Wing, I was so starstruck by getting EDS rep that I just completely blew by all of the problematic stuff. And it's only like when I actually see other people like deconstructing it, I'm like, oh, yeah, that is actually really bad. Yeah. So it's very interesting to deconstruct it now as somebody who just went straight through it in the original reading.
I think that's also like a common experience and discussion point, right? Of like, oh, well, like I've just never had this representation before. And so I just grabbed it with 2 hands and I ran with it and I loved it and I didn't stop to think. I feel like that is amazing. Like if you had that reading experience, right? Like you got to experience that joy and that comfort, you know, despite if the book had problematics in it or not. I do find myself a little bit envious of the people who really, really loved Fourth Wing because I went into that thinking, oh, I really want to love this too. Ableism is one of those things that society is kind of steeped in, right? And so you really don't know it's there until someone points it out to you. And unfortunately, it's just in so many different things that it's impossible to catch it all. I will commend Fourth Wing. I would like to thank Fourth Wing for hopefully opening the door, you know, to like more mainstream representation so that we can have more of these conversations and more of the varied representations of the same disability. I would really love to sort of own 3 books with EDS rep in it specifically. So then I can be like, I have 3 of these books, like 3 of these exist. That would just be the dream for me.
Stepping back a little bit to the toxic perseverance thing, obviously Fourth Wing is like on own voices. So I wonder if there was that lack of like burnout and consequence, partially because 1, it's the author's fantasy to some extent. And then 2, I know that already, even when there weren't very many consequences for Violet, people, I haven't read Fourth Wing, by the way, just as a disclaimer, so this is all just me sort of absorbing it secondhand, but I saw a lot of people reviewing it and saying, oh, Violet's whiny, she's always complaining, etc., etc. So I wonder, and this is something that I've been worried about with my own writing. I have a project at the moment which has all disabled protagonists and one who has sort of a fatigue disorder type thing. And I'm thinking, oh, he needs to burn out here, but then also I'm messing up the pacing if I do that, or maybe people are going to get bored kind of thing. So it's an interesting balancing act. So obviously don't want to put words in the author's mouth, but I wonder if that was part of the reasoning for not having those moments of consequence and necessary rest.
Yeah, I feel that as a writer, because one of the number one mandates of writing to be published is you want to make sure that you keep your reader hooked, that, you keep them wanting to read on. And so if you do have a lot of slow paced, moments, you run the risk of sort of losing people, especially in a genre like a dragon fantasy specifically, where the expectation is very much that this is going to be high octane, fast paced. We're in a brutal military academy. Things are not going to go slow. But I think there are ways to kind of skirt around that while still being mindful of your disability representation, because it doesn't really have to be really long, right? So something that I do in my writing a lot is, in my current novel project, is I every now and again have my character kind of just in their internal narration think oh my God, I've been in pain for days, or, something to that effect. So you're reminding the reader that this is something that is an ongoing thing. It's not something that just disappears and then comes back when we need to up the stakes. Sometimes I will just have, I don't know how natural it is, but sometimes there are time skips where it's oh, I spend 2 days kind of going back and forth from the bath to ease my chronic pain. It doesn't have to be super long. And I think that's the thing, is I'm oh, I can see ways in which you could still do this. And I guess I kind of feel sad at what I perceive to be lost potential, maybe, because sometimes I do encounter books where I think this is really great. I just wish you could really put me into the character's bodily experience instead of, I don't know if this is too harsh, but I feel I do this too, and I struggle with it, is catering to the non-disabled reader first before the disabled reader, because I do think skipping over those important moments or the realistic consequences, I think they benefit the non-disabled reader most sometimes. And sometimes I, as a disabled reader, want to be the one who the story is written for, I guess, is how I would phrase that.
Yeah, we mentioned this on our last year's episode, and we also did an episode on it, but I think Godkiller does really well at rooting you in that experience. And Kanan never forgets about Kissen's disability. She never forgets about the fact that if Kissen is pushing herself, she's going to be in pain. But I think still does very well at keeping the action very high. Same with Sunbringer, the sequel. It never really slows down. But you still get what feels like a fairly realistic portrayal as someone that does not have a prosthetic or anything, so I can't speak on that directly. But it feels like she's been very mindful the whole time, and she has had sensitivity readers, etc., to help with that. So
yeah, and one thing that I really, really loved about Godkiller specifically, I feel this is an example that kind of ties back to what we were talking about before with not slowing down the pacing but still sort of being realistic. There's a moment when Kissen and Elo, they're sort of kissing, getting hot and heavy with it. You as the reader are okay, they're about to bang. And then Kissen just kind of asks leg on or off, should I remove my prosthetic, or would you feel more comfortable if I keep it on? And I was just really happy with the fact that, one, the question was asked, and it was just yes, of course she would ask that, or she would consider her prosthetic when becoming intimate. But then the other thing I really liked was that Elo was just whatever you like, whatever you prefer. And it's yes, that's what I want, is someone who just respects the disabled person. I want the disabled person to bring these things up. It didn't become this huge laborious conversation that slowed down the pacing, which I think a lot of people often bring up in reviews, right? Of oh, well, if they stopped kissing and they negotiated the sex before they had it, it just wouldn't be sexy anymore. And it's well, I don't know, maybe for disabled readers it would be sexy because that's how they engage in sexual activity, right? Because that is a reality for them. And so again, it's the non-disabled reader's comfort versus the disabled reader's comfort, I think, is a balancing act always.
And even if you're not disabled, is that not such a beautiful way to demonstrate the trust between them and the fact that he respects her? I don't know, I also absolutely adore that moment.
Also in terms of toxic perseverance in that series, as in how they don't do it, in Sunbringer, I'm not going to give too many spoilers, but the whole first act is Kissen pushing herself too far. And then she basically spends the whole second act not moving on top of a mountain as she recovers because she's pushed herself so hard. And there is this really beautiful sort of moment of her getting to rest and getting to heal and getting to get her strength back because she has pushed herself way too far. And I feel that is really satisfying to see, because you do actually get to see her have consequences, but then also at the same time still have an arc and still get to be doing things in the meantime.
I'm having a brainwave. Like, I have yet to read Sunbringer. I'm okay if we spoil it all. Because I don't mind spoilers. But basically, like, as you were talking, I was thinking, see, that is what empowerment is to me, is like, perhaps paradoxically, right? Because you're talking about a character with a disability who ends up immobilized and having to heal. But the empowerment aspect of that for me comes in when you consider the fact that, like, to heal, there's an interdependence of humanity that comes into play, like a collective care. And I think for me, an empowering narrative can still have a disabled character push themselves too hard, be, immobilized or need to rest long term. But you can still have that be empowering in some ways, I think, by having this teaching. I guess, like, I know we don't want books to be too moralistic, but I guess exemplifying ways in which a disabled person can take care of themselves is empowering to me. Also showing like collective care, like the side characters coming in with a hot water bottle or like bringing them food, whatever it might be, showing that they have a support network. I would like to shift the focus of like a power fantasy or an empowerment narrative to one that works within the disability, not one that sort of either erases the disability or relies on someone pushing past their disability.
And I feel like you could very easily, we were talking earlier about the toxic perseverance element being about overcoming your disability, but I think you could easily fold that nicely into a character arc where it's about overcoming your internalized ableism, maybe. If you see the same character push themselves too far the first time, and then maybe even feel guilty about resting and not rest effectively, and then the next time they push themselves too far, they go, okay, they acknowledge what they did, they lean on their community for support, they don't allow themselves to feel guilty about it, or they at least deconstruct their guilty feelings and go, okay, well, I feel guilty, but maybe I shouldn't feel guilty. I feel like that's a much more interesting and powerful arc to write than just I've pushed and pushed further and I did the thing and magically there's no consequences.
Yeah, I feel like with that specifically, like the unlearning of internalized ableism, that would be empowering to me. Like, I just kind of think sometimes, what kind of person would I be, or what kind of ideologies would I have right now at 27 if from the ages of like 12 to 18, I had read books that told me being disabled is okay, actually. Like, being disabled is not my fault. It's not a moral failing. It doesn't make me lazy when I can't do things. Like, what if I had grown up with media that told me that all the time instead of the opposite, which is that I'm a burden, or if ever I say I can't do something, someone will think that I'm being lazy. That's the core of empowerment, is acceptance, right? And learning that we can take care of ourselves and we can prioritize the health that we have. That's not a negative thing. When it comes to power fantasies and wish fulfillment, I did wonder and have had several discussions about Fourth Wing specifically and whether it is a power fantasy or if it's wish fulfillment, because of the fact that it sort of skips over a lot of the raw realities. I think that these stories, like the power fantasies and wish fulfillment stories, can be really great and they offer a lot of like much needed escapism sometimes. But then there is a question that always comes up for me when I read some of them, and that is, to what extent are we complicit in our own oppression when we uphold these narratives and ideologies, and when we romanticize through fiction that which is harmful to us in real life? Because I think if we start going like, oh, the power fantasy is that I push through my disability, instead of the power fantasy is that I have the support I need in order to succeed, like, what is that saying?
Yeah,
I think that's very well put. I haven't thought about it in those terms before, but that's really interesting.
Unfortunately for everyone around me, this is like a special interest of mine. And so I'm constantly thinking about it. I am no longer in university, but I have like I think the plural of thesis is theses, right? Which is really weird. Or am I making that up? I feel like I Google it every time. But basically, like, I do have like very long form essays on the go, because like this is such a special interest and like a study area of mine. And so, like, obviously when you emailed and were like, would you like to talk about this? I was like, oh my God, captive audience. Of course. Now I can info dump.
Well, that's extremely fortunate for us because now we're like drawing on all of your expertise. I want to also ask you about like your own writing, how you incorporate disabled characters into your own writing. Why, I suppose. I guess we've sort of already vaguely talked about that.
So the why of it probably just comes down simply to because I exist. And so I'm like, why shouldn't I be in stories? And I never used to think this way. Like, it never used to occur to me. I was just kind of blind to the fact of my absence. And by I'm referring generally to like the disabled identity. But I think like another why is the fact that there is not nearly enough disability representation in any media, whether it's books or TV shows or movies. And I just think that growing up in a world that constantly feeds you media laden with stories that do not represent or respect disability has been painful. The pain isn't really something that I knew that I was feeling as a kid. It's sort of like I grew up and I was like, oh, I've been stabbed a million times. Kind of like that scene in Frozen where Olaf is like, oh, look at that, I've been impaled. It's sort of like just this thing that happened and you don't realize it until you look down and you see the gaping hole. And I think, like I said earlier, a lot of my internalized ableism, I think, was instilled in me not just through the attitudes of the real life people around me, but also through the disability narratives that we did get in TV and movies and books. And so it's sort of important to me that we break the cycle. I don't know if it's appropriate to sort of use that sort of language in this context, but I do see it as kind of like a spinning wheel that cycles around and around and around. By having disabled characters in my books, I would really like to model I don't want to be so bold as to say I want to model good disability representation because it's so subjective, but I would like to, at least on my end, try and do my best to represent people with my disability and maybe other disabilities in ways that make them feel like I considered them when I was writing the story. I didn't just write a story and forget them, or I didn't just write a story and whack them in there. I would like to be very mindful.
I think the cycle is an appropriate metaphor here, because I assume that we were all the kind of people that were writing little stories from the age of like 6 or 7 in primary school just for fun. And I definitely feel like when I was like first writing, I was always gravitating towards fantasy as well. I was copying what I saw to some extent. And obviously if you grow up reading stories where disability is so often just a analog for, oh, this person is the villain, you end up just imitating that subconsciously, not really even realizing that that's what you're doing. But you think, oh, how do I make this character memorable? I know, I'll give them one eye, I'll put them in a wheelchair, I'll do whatever, without thinking about the implications of what you're doing. If you don't at any point go back and reflect on what you're doing, of course it becomes a cycle, because then the next generation of young writers sees that and goes, okay, that's how I write a bad guy, or whatever it might be, and then it just continues on and on. Or even more critically, someone like that can't be the protagonist, so I won't write that protagonist.
Yeah. It's like this, okay, natural segue into something called the narrative prosthesis, right? So to my understanding, disability as narrative prosthesis is what you're talking about, right? So the practice of using a disabled body as a device first and foremost. So for example, when a character is given a disability to distinguish them from the norm, or when the villain in every Bond movie is given some sort of disability or disfigurement, right? Because they're the villain. So of course, like James Bond would never be disabled. Narrative prosthesis as well is like the use of disability as a metaphorical device to prop up a narrative rather than including disabled people because disabled people exist, and including them as these fully lived people who have backstories and family and wants and needs. Disability representation is fine when they're the villain, or it's fine when they die, or it's fine when they're a set piece or something like that. That's the issue that I have, is that, well, we are actually real people too. And sometimes we can be protagonists. Sometimes we can fly dragons and kill people. Sometimes we can engage in illegal necromancy. Like, it's fine. No one is going to die. Well, like some people might die, but
yeah.
Yeah. I remember, because I'm also a writer, and I remember when I have this character who I've been writing since I was 13, and obviously I was writing her in a very sort of abled way because like that's all I'd ever seen. And I was like 17 and I was just writing. I was like, and then her knee dislocates. And then it felt illegal to have written it, to be like, hang on, she can be disabled? This, and then it kind of blew my mind for a second. I was like, oh my God, disabled protagonist who looks like me. I can write this. And it was this like the lights came on in my brain, and it was this like complete strange moment of like, hang on, I've never seen this before in books that I've been reading. Yeah, it's weird.
I wonder, that makes me think, because I also had like this awakening moment, like the light bulb moment of, wait, what if this character were disabled? What if they had my disability? What if I did that? Is that allowed? And I kind of wonder if that is a common light bulb moment for a lot of disabled creatives, because I do think like we're sort of conditioned to write able-bodied characters first and foremost. I only started writing a disabled novel, I think like in 2021. That's when I was like, oh, I can do that. And it's like, but my whole life, like I've written since I was a kid. My whole life, not once did I ever think to write a disabled character before then. Like that feels bananas because I live a disabled life. So like, what was happening there?
Yeah, I feel like it's a similar thing for most. Like, I feel like when I was growing up, I definitely wasn't writing characters of colour mainly, and I'm obviously this is a podcast, so people can't see me. I'm very white passing, but I am mixed race, and I wasn't writing trans characters, queer characters either, especially earlier on. I think I got to that a little bit earlier thanks to the world of fan fiction and seeing other people doing it and going, oh, this is allowed. I can do this too. But even then, I think I had a bias towards cis male characters over trans male characters like myself, and then similarly with the disability thing. I think it's just so easy to fall into that habit of like, well, these are the way that characters are, because those are the ones I'm seeing. And then even if you have that lived experience, like I've heard authors of colour talk about like writing white protagonists, despite the fact that that's not a reflection of them because those are the only protagonists they've seen.
It feels like a sad act of self-erasure almost, that, you know, the first kind of person that you visualize being in a story is someone who is not at all like you. I mean, they might share some characteristics like they drink tea without milk and things like that, but they don't share your identity. I had a moment of realization like this with my therapist once where I was like, wow, people like me or like myself did not exist in my own mind. And how does that make sense? And then I think that was like one of the moments where I first sort of got into disability theory and disability studies and advocacy, was just that moment of what the heck have I been doing this whole time? And it was like something had been lifted from my eyes. And I think that's also like, hopefully with my disability anthology, you know, it would just be the ultimate dream if someone could read that and then be like, oh, I can do that too. Because like, yes, of course you can. We can all do it. You don't need permission, but you have my permission. Like if you need someone to say it's okay, then I will say it.
Yeah. Another thing that I've found as well with writing is my current project has multiple point of views. I can't remember who was the first one who I decided I was going to make disabled, but at some point as I was developing, I've ended up making all of the main point of view characters disabled. And still, that feels kind of illegal. Like, I'm like, well, it's all of them, and people are going to be like, well, why is it all four of them? And I'm like, well, because of these reasons, and because I want to, quite frankly, and why not? But there is still some, like, voice in the back of my head that's like, oh, that's not allowed. You can't have all of them be, which is so ridiculous.
It feels like the same sort of paradox of the whole, like, oh, there's more than one gay character? What?
Yeah.
It's like, we come in groups. Like, this is how it works.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, textually, this is also something that these characters bond over, and yet there's still something in my brain that's like, well...
I just really love the idea of a story that has, you know, more than two disabled characters. I think that's amazing. And I think, yeah, the whole why not is just sort of like a blaring big thing in my brain now, because it is sort of like, why not? Like, what's wrong with it? It's never something I'm really going to understand or see eye to eye on with anyone who has a reason for the why not. And I'm just also sort of thinking about one of the truths of my life, which is that neurodivergent people sort of converge together, or like they will find each other. And this is probably not like a universal truth or true for everybody. But as someone with autism, like, yes, it has very much been true. And so like the idea of me sort of putting one autistic character in a book feels wrong. Paradoxically, like I'm sort of like, oh, can I put a disabled character in this book? But then when it comes to like an autistic character, I'm like, well, I need at least two. Like they need a friend. They need someone to info dump with. It just feels really like a fact of life for me, at least in my experience of like a lot of my friends have turned out to be neurodivergent. And so I think like if someone says, well, why is there more than one disabled character? I'm just going to have to say like, yeah, we come in groups. Sometimes it's a 2-for-1 package deal. Like you can't get rid of one without getting rid of the other. And I'm not willing to get rid of one. So
I think that's an interesting one that I think sometimes happens even before people know. And similarly with queer people, similarly with neurodivergent people, somehow we just find each other. Like I can say for Morgan and I's experience that we definitely both thought we were able when we met each other, and that's just not true. So
we've just been going around collecting identities in a circle like that.
Exactly. So I suppose for people who are listening to this and they're like, I'm going to put disabled characters in my writing, what would you guys recommend people? How do you start?
I think for a lot of people, especially like non-disabled writers, this is a very big question, right? Because I think a lot of us, well, not me because I'm not non-disabled, but I think a lot of people want to do the right thing, right? And I think disability is one of those things that feels huge and something that you'll never be able to understand. There is always a fear there of like messing up. I think of that phrase like nothing about us without us, which basically means nothing about disabled people without disabled people's input. So in the context of writing, I think if you're not disabled, you should do your due diligence, be careful, read up, listen and learn from us, but don't beg free labor from us because we're not here to like teach you. But if you do have the opportunity to pay someone, or you do have the opportunity to have a conversation in that vein, then absolutely. I think it's really important to sort of hear what we have to say. The other tips that I have are probably get some critique partners, sensitivity readers. If you've finished writing something, sensitivity readers are people that you can pay, or if you're best friends with them, maybe they'll do it for free. They will read your work and sort of look out for things that might come across as insensitive or lacking in knowledge or even potentially harmful. This is not just for disabled characters or disabled people too. You can get sensitivity readers for basically everything. The other thing is I would recommend looking up and being mindful of stereotypes. There are way too many stereotypes for you to ever memorize them all. Even me, I just have bookmarked like 3 specific websites that have, lists of disability sort of stereotypes, so that when I am writing or when I have an idea or something, I can kind of go through those lists and be like, okay, am I inadvertently or accidentally engaging with something that might be harmful? And if so, like, what can I do to fix it? And then lastly, I think if you have the time and are able to, I would say reading nonfiction works and essays by disabled advocates. Disability Visibility by Alice Wong is a good one. That's always a favorite of mine. There is another one, which I always recommend to people. I think it's called Disfigured, like on fairy tales, and it talks about disability in the fairy tale context, which I found incredibly enlightening and helpful because it posited a really important question for me, which was, why is it that in all of these tales, the disabled person changes to fit the world, but the world never changes to fit or accommodate them? And I think that's like another key thing, is how are you accommodating the disabled characters in your world? Because it's all well and good to have a character who uses a wheelchair, but if all of your architecture in the world, there are no ramps, right? Then it's sort of like, well, how do they get around? Like, you have to be willing to kind of think through some of those things as well. I think that exhausts my list, but there are a lot of things I think that you can do.
I think one of the really important things is also to not treat disabled people as a monolith. Like, we all have very different experiences and we all have different disabilities. So you can't go to someone with EDS and be like, tell me about how an amputee lives. You really have to make sure that, like, you're being specific in your representation and that you are getting the sensitivity readers and researching the right specific things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've even in one disability, like with fibro and chronic fatigue, I know people who are like wheelchair bound who have the same thing that I do. So obviously my experience is going to be completely different to somebody else's, able to leave the house under my own steam and stuff. So I think if you can talk to multiple people with the disability that you're trying to represent, you're going to get a whole picture of that disability, and probably your representation will end up better for it.
On the topic of trying to do the right thing, or like engaging in these sort of conversations with people who have the disability you might want to include in your book. And this is something that as a writer and as a person in general, I'm always trying to be mindful of too, but I still fall into the trap of not thinking about it because it's not been taught to me, right? The first 22 formative years of my life was spent consuming non-disabled media because that's what's given to us freely and so readily and so often. And so in trying to create more inclusive worlds, or in trying to create and include disabled characters, I think we have to be willing to sit in any discomfort we might elicit by not knowing better and by messing up. And so basically that means like, try. You may very well mess up or write something that someone points out and says, hey, that is harmful, or hey, that hurt my feelings, or hey, that's insensitive. You have to be willing to sit with that discomfort and acknowledge it, and then try and do better. Listen to the advice that you're given, listen to the feedback. And shame and, like embarrassment and feeling bad about having done something wrong can be so incredibly hard to work through, but we are all unlearning these things. And so if you mess up, that's a reality. I do it all the time. My first novel in particular was like riddled with things where some of my non-disabled friends even were pointing it out and being like, isn't this kind of ableist? And I was like, I never really thought about it. This is just stuff that I've heard growing up, right? So like, we do it too. Disabled people can write things that are, not perfect as well. So you might be dreading doing something wrong, but you still have to try.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I can't speak for everyone, but at least from my point of view, I would much rather see someone try earnestly and then be willing to learn from that if they do make a mistake, rather than just not try. Otherwise you get into that sort of dangerous zone of the onus is entirely on the disabled community to be their own representation, which is kind of already a thing. So it would be nice to see some abled writers also contributing to reversing that.
I'm sort of thinking about how, like, I am going to bring up Harry Potter, but I am acknowledging the horrible things that JK Rowling has said and done.
It's a useful touchstone, though.
Yeah. So, like, not bringing it up because I endorse it, but I am bringing it up because it perfectly exemplifies what we're talking about. And it is that Hogwarts is the embodiment of what if we made stairs worse? I guess, like, it's just very, very lucky that there isn't a single wheelchair user in the castle, right? That to me is an example of an author who did not even think about how disabled people or disabled students or teachers would get around in the castle. And she wrote how many books and nothing changed? I was not old enough to be engaging in any of the sort of like, isn't this a problem discourse back then, like when they were being written? But I have to imagine some people out there were pointing it out and discussing it. It's a case of like, unfortunately, more often than not, we get mythical creatures and aliens and ridiculous moving staircases before we get disabled people in fictional societies. It takes a lot of thought, I think, because you have to reteach yourself to think about this stuff. But you should do it, is my advice.
And what's always really rubbed me the wrong way about that is that when it was pointed out, she went, well, there's no disabled people because magic fixes all disability. And then when people went, well, what about, like, Mad Eye Moody, who uses a prosthetic eye? And then she went, well, magic disabled him, so magic can't undo his disability. I think it was just a plaster on, you haven't written any disabled people. And for me, that's so much worse than just saying, you know what, you're right. It was the late 80s when I started this series. I wasn't thinking about it. In the future, I'll try and do better. Obviously, Rowling those words will never pass her lips on any topic whatsoever. But I just think that it would be so forgivable if you just said, listen, you know what, I didn't think about it, and there's kids who have read that book and now can't see themselves in that world, and I'm sorry for that. As opposed to just doubling down. Like, if you can admit when you've made mistakes as a writer, your audience is going to have so much more faith in you, and then you're just going to write better stuff in the future because you can grow, as opposed to backtracking and trying to act like you're perfect at all times. Like, we all make mistakes, that's fine.
Yeah, her sort of response of like, oh, well, magic cures all disability. Like, I definitely thought of that. It just reads as such a cop-out excuse of like, she can't just admit that, oh yeah, I didn't consider it. An apology, an acknowledgement would have gone such a long way. Again, like, you just have to be okay with messing up because it will happen. It happens all the time. You just have to know how to handle that. And I'm not saying I know how to handle that, but I do think, you know, the first step is acknowledging that you messed up a bit, because I think the majority of the time when people tell you that you messed up or point out something that you did, right, they're not doing it to pick a fight. And so the conversation really will very likely just be, hey, you wrote this thing, it feels XYZ kind of way. I would much rather the conversation be had and like you work out the ruffles and the kinks than just sort of go, no, that's too hard. I'm not going to include a whole identity. Excluding any identity, I think, is bad. But when I think about disability specifically, I think the theory is that I think 20% of the world is disabled. And so it's like, when you break it down like that, you're saying like 1/5 of the world's population doesn't deserve to exist in books. That seems kind of bananas to me.
Especially when it's one of the few marginalizations that everyone will end up being included in at some point in their life, unless, I don't know, they get hit by a car and die early or something. That's, yeah. But like, everybody becomes disabled eventually. So why are we not thinking about that at all? Why are able people going, it's not relevant to me? Because it is. It will be. And even if it isn't relevant to you, it's relevant to other people. So.
Yeah, and not to harp on Harry Potter again, but I think it is this view that Rowling clearly takes of able people as so fundamentally different, because if you think about something like the fact that Harry wears glasses, that never gets fixed by magic. That is arguably a disability. He needs an aid to see, like the majority of the population. There's this arbitrary line in most people's head of what counts as a disability and what doesn't. And obviously that's one of the ones that usually most people would not consider that a disability because it's just so common, and because it's, in inverted commas, so easy to deal with. Obviously it depends on what your actual situation is. But if you went back even a couple of 100 years when it was so expensive to get good eyeglasses, etc., then that could be an extremely disabling issue. It is, I think, this fundamental, us and them approach, but I think disability is a spectrum that people don't really see as a spectrum often.
It's sort of an issue, at least in part, of needing a shared vocabulary, right? Like a shared understanding of what things mean, because I think even just the word disabled being perceived as this negative label is sort of like, well, what do you think that word actually means? Some people have said to me like, well, I got married, I went to university, I had, 17 kids, I raised 4 cats, and they will list off all of these things. And my question in response to that is, but did your disability go away like when you did that? Do you think that disabled people are disabled from doing anything? Like, I'm not really clear on what the point is. And so a lot of people will be like, well, because I was able to do those things, I don't identify as disabled. And I think that then we get into like the semantics of like, okay, well, would you say that you have an impairment? And then it's sort of like, well, what is the difference between a disability and an impairment? Because like under the social model of disability, anyone with an impairment is not disabled by their impairment, but rather by their environment and the infrastructure and the systems and the architecture. There are just a lot of big nebulous ideas, or rather there are ideas that feel very big and nebulous, but which have been studied at length. And so you can learn to understand these things. It's just like, are you going to go to the effort to do that? And also, do you know where to begin? Maybe in trying to find a way to round this back to the how do you include disability in your world, I think a good starting point is to sort of ask a bunch of questions. And so I think some of those questions can be simple, like, well, how would a disabled person navigate my world? Imagine a person in a wheelchair and go, well, how would they get to the church if I've put it on a mountain and everyone has to climb 200 stairs before they do their daily prayer? Have you then barred disabled people from going to church? And then what is the message you're sending with that? Like, are they sinful because they can't pray in the church? It does feel quite intricate. And then I think also looking at your current world building and asking, have I excluded anyone from being able to participate in society in general? And if I have, then why did I do that? Or how have I done that? Another question is probably who benefits the most from that exclusion, both in the fictional world and in the real world, right? Like, who benefits from you excluding disabled people from all of your books? Why is that a choice that you are making? Who in your fantasy world is benefiting from the exclusion of disabled people, and why? One thing I'm learning as a writer is like constantly asking myself how and why is key. A lot of the time, like, you write what you like, you write what excites you. You don't necessarily stop to think about how somebody else might perceive that. The whole exercise of writing to me has been like rambling to a bunch of people and being like, is this a good idea? Have I accidentally implied that disabled people are worth less because that's the last thing I want to do? It's sort of about, everything in conversation, which is like a really good model in general, I think, when it comes to disability as well, right? Because disability kind of necessitates interdependence. We will always at some point sort of rely on somebody else to do something for us or to help us in some way, whether that's a doctor or a mum or a sibling, whether you need accommodations or like a service or something like that. As a writer, having a group of people that you trust to be honest with you, and having a group of people that you can sort of have these conversations with, or who can help direct you to people with whom you can have those conversations, is a good thing to have.
What you just said has made me think as well about, like, from the world building process, I think you need to be thinking about what your society is going to consider as disabled. I'm reminded of a Dungeons & Dragons game that Morgan and I ran many, many years ago, where a player at the table was an Averial, a winged elf. And I don't think Morgan even ever found this out because the campaign fell apart, but she had a partner who didn't have wings. So in the context of his society, he was definitely disabled on the social model of disability because he didn't have the accommodations in place. He basically had to be escorted from island to island by his girlfriend the majority of the time because that was his only option. But then if you took him out of that context into a society that was not based on a bunch of floating islands, then arguably his disability, it didn't obviously disappear because that was something that, was fundamental to his identity, but changed in that context. So from that point of view of that society, of course they're going to consider that a disability. Another society is not going to consider that a disability. Similarly, you might have society where I'm thinking of Deep Light by Frances Hardinge, where a large majority of the population have some hearing loss or are deaf because they dive a lot and the pressure changes damage their hearing over time. Arguably, you could say, oh, well, obviously they're disabled, they have hearing loss. But from the point of view of that society, there were a lot of accommodations and adaptations in place because such a large proportion of that society had hearing loss. Basically, everybody knew sign language. Nobody was really othering that population in any way. It was just like, oh, the most other thing about them is that they can dive really deep. That's pretty cool, and they can get the better treasure. And there was no, discrimination or anything. So arguably that society wasn't considering them disabled. So I think you have to think about that context before you go create a world. And, maybe you do want to imply that disabled people are sinful in your world, but then follow that idea through to their conclusion. Presumably you're not saying that as a writer. So how does that fit into your story, I suppose?
Yeah, don't let your messaging be accidental, I guess, is the thing, right? So it's okay to write a story in which everybody hates disabled people. It will be a hard sell to make me read it, but you can do that. That is allowed. as long as it is intentional, right? And like you have actually thought about this and it's like a meaningful exploration of what it would be like to live in a world like that. I can't remember what the title of the book is that I read. It was a very strange experience for me where I think this character had complex PTSD, which I can't remember if it's considered a disability according to like the DSM-5 or not, but it can be disabling. So I think this character had CPTSD and was not a nice person, right? Like they were like, I have no trouble stabbing people, killing people, making fun of people. Like they're absolutely horrible. And I was like, this is not great. And also the way that the character thought about other disabled characters was not great. But I was like, I see what the author is doing, right? The author has given them complex PTSD and like trauma, and that has all informed how he acts and how he thinks. And so I'm kind of willing to sit with it and see where it goes. Whereas if you just write a character that is ableist and I don't see the text engaging with that at all, then I'm kind of like, wait, does the author actually think this way? There's something to be said for like, there's probably a legitimate name for this, but I think pattern making or like narrative weaving is one way to think about it, right? Of like, what suggestion are you making? And is it intentional? The question is, what am I saying by using the story elements that I'm using or by writing the story that I'm writing? The example that comes to mind is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, which I read and I really enjoyed, but it made me think a lot about the way we create patterns in our stories. The way disability was included in Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies created a pattern in my mind that suggested disabled characters were not being treated as people. I guess you can kind of visualize it as like tallies for and against the theory. So every now and again, I'll pick up a book and I'll be like, oh, that feels a little bit like indicative of like an author who hasn't thought about, disability. And so that's a tally 4. And then if I find something else in the book that's like, oh no, they did think about it, then I'm like, cool. Which is not to say like I'm always judging books on a scoreboard or anything, but this is sort of like a visual example. In Emily Wilde, we had the changeling character, which I think most people know as sort of like a narrative that both fictional and real that has caused harm to autistic people. So that was the beginning of the pattern for me, where I was like, okay, I'm going to side-eye this book a little bit and see how they handle any more disability. Then later, we have a character who is like broken by the fairy, for all intents and purposes, has what I thought could be analogous to an intellectual disability. Then she is also treated as an object of study by the protagonist. The way that she follows directions is described as abhorrent, and she's described as a puppet on strings. And that felt a bit accidentally dehumanizing, even though I could see what the author was doing there, right? That made me feel a bit eek too. So I kind of was like, we're on shaky ground here of like, how safe do I feel? And then Emily, the protagonist, begins asking questions about that woman as though it's any of her business to begin with. And then I was thinking about how disabled people often lack agency and autonomy and privacy. So that felt like another thing where I was like, oh, I'm not sure I love that. I will say that one of Emily's intentional, like built-in flaws is sort of this lack of immediate empathy. It did feel somewhat intentional, but still as like a disabled reader, I'm like not exactly super comfortable with the way disability is being treated. Lastly, some of the fairy tales that the protagonist writes about in her diary, they all have what either explicitly are or could be read as disabled characters who are mistreated and or described as ugly due to having a deformity. That was all of the instances of disability in the book. They were the only instances of disability in the book. To me, they were creating a pattern of disabled people are being used as that narrative prosthesis that I mentioned. They're being used to make a point, right? Or to like up the stakes rather than like be an actual central or meaningful character or just even just like a side character who is cool. From a writer's perspective, what I try to be careful of or like considerate of is what pattern I might be creating. So if I have 3 scenes with a disabled character, are those 3 scenes saying anything? Are they suggesting anything? It's not that I'm saying that you should always account for like a reader who will give you the least benefit of the doubt, right? Like work yourself in circles trying to predict how people will misunderstand what you've written. But it is a worthwhile thing to do, I think, of, like really sitting back and looking at the disabled people that you have in your stories and asking if it might be buying into something that's harmful or just not something that you really wanted to say.
And I feel like that can often come up if you have less disabled characters, then it can be easier to fall into like that kind of negative pattern. Whereas if this happens with queer characters too, if you've only got one queer character and they're the villain, then even if you're not doing it multiple times, you're sort of playing into like a wider societal pattern. Whereas if you have a couple of queer heroes and a couple of queer villains, it feels less like you're saying something about queerness. And then similarly with disability, if you have a couple of disabled protagonists, a couple of disabled villains, it feels less like you're saying something about disability making you villainous because you have a wider representation. It becomes more incidental to their morality. Obviously, you might have more morally great characters if you're listening to this as a writer, and then it becomes a little bit more complicated. But again, if you have a couple of characters, then I feel like it's easier to avoid falling into a negative pattern because they're all going to be different, naturally.
Yes, multiplicity of representation is really good. Yeah, like you said, it kind of allows you to have different portrayals of like either the same disability or different disabilities. You can very well have a character who pushes through everything and overworks himself and doesn't yet see any consequences. And then if you have a second disabled character who does the same thing and does see consequences, then I as the reader can key into that and be like, okay, this is an author who does not believe that disabled people can just push through harder and like win the day, including multiple disabled characters or multiple queer characters, like you said, multiple characters of color, showing that they are multifaceted, that we're not all a monolith, we're not all the same. That's always, I think, like a pretty good way to go.
Well, before we sign off, sadly, the submissions will be closed by the time this comes out. But if people want to follow the development of the Disability and Fantasy anthology, where can they find you at it?
Probably the two easiest places to find me. Twitter.com, which I am calling Twitter.com because I really don't want to call it X.com. My username there is @LaTHolmes. That's easy to find. The second place you can probably find me, if you want to be like annoyed by dumb posts, like that's where I just post all the stuff that pops into my head. There is no filter, is on Tumblr. My username is the same there. And I also will be posting updates about the anthology there as well. I think those two are probably the best places because you can also message me or, get in contact if there are questions. As for the anthology specifically, yes, the submissions period will be closed and the anthology does not have a set release date yet. But if you do follow me on social media, then you will absolutely be keyed into that as I muddle my way through the process of putting it together, doing the marketing, getting a street team together, all of that sort of stuff. Oh, and if anyone wants to at me on Twitter and have a cool conversation or maybe argue a bit, I'm cool with that.
I feel personally like I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that your Linktree on your Twitter leads to some of the stories that you've put out there, and they're very cool. You should go read them.
Oh my god, thank you. I forgot about my Linktree. If people want to read some of my published work, yes, I have a Linktree, which is, I think, linked on my Twitter, and possibly my Tumblr as well. Okay, cool. I'm glad I have you here to fact check me on that.
We'll put all of that in the show notes for people who are listening to this, so you can all access it easily.
Yay!
So next episode, we will be kicking off a historical autumn, and we'll be reading The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley, alongside Hidden Bookcase's lovely editor, Kit Lovick. I'm so excited to finally get to read a Pulley book on the show, and I cannot wait to hear what Morgan thinks, but that is all I will say for now.
Until then, you're always welcome through the bookcase.
Don't forget to scritch the cat on your way out. Thank you for listening to The Hidden Bookcase, a production of Plain Art Prod. On this episode, you heard Ella T. Holmes, Morgan Greensmith, and Soren Brywood discussing writing disability representation in fantasy. A massive thank you to Ella for joining on this episode, you were phenomenal. You can find her on Twitter or Tumblr @EllaTHolmes, or on Substack @EllaHasThoughts. You can find The Hidden Bookcase on Twitter @Hidden Bookcase, and on Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr and TikTok @Hidden Bookcase Podcast. Find out more about Plain Art Prod at plainartprod.com. Know what we should read next, or want to chat to us about what you thought of this episode? You can reach us at thehiddenbookcase@gmail.com, send us a DM on social media, or come chat with your fellow bookworms in our growing Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Want to support The Hidden Bookcase? Support us on Patreon for bonus episodes, audio outtakes, playlists, and other extras. Buy a book through our bookshop.org page, or consider leaving us a rating or a review or telling a friend how to find us. Your whispers are the best way for bookworms to discover our show. For our next episode, we'll be kicking off a historical autumn, for real this time, with The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley, alongside Kit Lovick, who edits on The Hidden Bookcase. We hope to see you then, and in the meantime, you're always welcome through the bookcase.